Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks, where we meet with the top thought leaders and strategists in emerging technologies, digital assets, the regulatory landscape, and capital markets. This segment is presented by Charles Schwab. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, and joining me on the desk at the Nasdaq market site, we have Dr. Sadek Wahba, Chairman and Managing Partner of I2 Capital, Juan Monterrey, Special Representative for Climate Change and National Climate Change Director of the Ministry of Environment of the Government of Panama, Gregorio Esteban, Vice Chairman of Santa Ana Global, and Stephen Keppel, President of the Public Foundation. We're here to discuss sustainable and scalable infrastructure and climate investing solutions. It is great to have all of you with us, especially during Climate Week NYC, the 21st to the 28th of September. Let's go around the table, understand where everyone fits within the ecosystem. Dr. Wahba, we will kick it off with you. It is great to have you here in person, finally.
Thank you.
Tell us about I2 and the work you're doing there.
Thanks for having us, Jill. It's a pleasure. I2 Capital is a private equity fund that invests principally in infrastructure. We currently manage about $60 billion of investments. Some of it is in energy transition, but interestingly, it's global. So we don't invest only in the US, but we invest in high growth economies, including Panama and other economies globally.
Yeah, and so tell us more about the work that you're doing with government in Panama.
So I basically represent Panama in all the environmental negotiations under the UN on climate, biodiversity, oceans, desertification, and plastic. And what we're putting forward is a proposal to address nature as a cohesive strategy, because for the longest time we have been fragmenting the ecosystem on so many different pieces. And today our president launched our Nature Pledge, which is our roadmap to sustainability to 2035.
And Gregorio, tell us about the work at Santa Ana Global.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much for having me here, Jill. Santa Ana is a master planner developer for sustainable microcities in Latin America. We're currently developing 3 projects, one in Chile, one in Panama, one in Colombia, and addressing the housing deficit of the middle class in Latin America. And of course, it's great to be here talking about infrastructure. You know, so interesting for our business.
Yeah, it is certainly interesting times, that's for sure. And Stephen, tell us about Public Foundation.
Sure, Public Foundation is a nonprofit global development organization. Our expertise lies in bridging the public and private sector with a goal of accelerating sustainable economic development around the world. Yeah. We do a lot of work across the UN system, so that's why we're here this week, thinking about how we can come up with new solutions for impact.
Yeah, it's so interesting because the conversation really has pivoted and shifted. Of course, AI demand really leading that charge there, not even just for one source of energy, but multiple sources of energy. And it seems to be that's what the conversation is around, Stephen, as well as how PPPs play into that.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing this week, you know, with Climate Week in the UN is there's a big conversation around how does the private sector, who's advancing full speed ahead on these issues like AI, engage with the public sector or the regulatory bodies that are going to have to find ways to make sure things advance in a way that benefits humanity. So I think, yeah, a lot of high-level conversations, but I think it shows, even during this really interesting time globally, that multilateralism and the UN system is still important.
Yeah, it certainly is. And Dr. Wahba, you and I have covered this for a number of years, not only from the sustainable perspective, but the importance of PPPs and a coherent and long-term policy is part of it as well.
That's exactly right. So you need to be able to have public-private partnerships that enable you to achieve the goals we've just been discussing. That partnership requires the private sector to have the proper incentives, but at the same time to be done in a way that from a public perspective, that's acceptable to the ultimate consumers and to society at large. That combination is not always easy. The United States is embarking on a new type of PPP. We've seen that with the government effectively taking on shares in companies like Intel, participating in NVIDIA. And that type of PPP, I think, is interesting and is the kind of opportunity that can become a benchmark for other things we can do over the coming years.
Yeah, and part of it, too, is getting the community buy-in as well. And I think understanding the audiences that you're talking to and how it's going to help the community, whether it's jobs, creating sustainable solutions, and how to advance the economy going forward, I think that's a big part of the equation.
Absolutely. And you know, governments and the UN system have miserably failed at simplifying and creating the standards so that the private sector and community members and all the actors can jump into it. For the past 30 years, we have been trying to curb down emissions. We have doubled. We have been trying to protect nature. We're assassinating half of our living creatures. And it all has to do because we're all confused. We don't have clear rules, we don't have clear standards, and that's what Panama is working on.
Yeah, and that was part of the challenge too, where it almost became, the policy was a mandate,
Yeah.
more than understanding, okay, what's the market demanding? How do the communities understand? I mean, for example, I'm curious to learn how you're addressing affordable housing and the middle income.
That's very interesting because what you're saying here is quite important because we're facing several challenges. The first one is to make this all the capital needs, all for the private sector to go ahead with all the SDGs, the ESG frameworks. But in Latin America, being an emerging market, ESG standards are just not realistic in most of the companies, the private companies, how to tackle this, how to apply all this framework in the action of the day-to-day business. So I think that SDG standards as a way more practical way to address an impact, because SDG standards are touching a lot of points that are measurable and have an impact over there. And of course, the challenge that all this transformation, all these adoptions of framework have a cost. And that cost we cannot put just on the shoulders of the final buyer or the consumer, because if we do things that way, what will happen is that the transformation will not happen or will be very slow. I mean, so the interaction of the PVPs, of course, and the implementation of that is very important.
Yeah. We talked about that off camera before, Stephen, that the electric, as an example, it's going to get to a point where the ROI for the consumer might not make any sense. But I think the pivot with the conversation now is it's more measurable and a little bit less subjective and arbitrary. We're understanding through hard data what these investments mean for enterprise anyway, in terms of operations and efficiency and compliance and so forth. So I think that's a critical shift.
Yeah, definitely. And I think as industry and the private sector advances with these new technologies like AI, it's important that they also pay attention to the environmental impact and the impact on the planet.
Right.
And that's what I think we're hearing a lot this week. And we're not saying, hey, slow down innovation. Innovation is extremely important, but let's also take an opportunity, as leaders across the planet to come together and consider this, and other technological advances and industrial revolutions, there's been a lot of environmental impact. With this next one coming through with AI, how can we get people at the table from the private sector, from the public sector, global leaders to better create the framework that Juan Carlos mentioned, so that going forward we don't have the same problems we had in the past.
Yeah.
But I want to go back to a point that you made, which I think is very important, which is over the last decade, we had an alphabet soup of different programs, rules, honestly, at the end of the day, that were contradictory, didn't make any sense. So I think what the government of Panama is doing is exactly that. It's trying to be able to simplify and make it very clear as to what the objectives are. So I think that's one important element. You're not going to regulate your way through finding efficient ways to reduce carbon. It has to be demand-driven. In part, people have to be convinced that they're willing to pay for it. And at the same time, there is no one solution. So it's all of the above, right? We've seen, for example, the need for having the development of data centers. And data centers, as we were talking, is a huge consumer of power. So are we going to only use renewable power? The truth is you can't. So it has to be renewable, it has to be gas-fired, it has to be batteries, it has to be at some point nuclear, although it will take time. So all of these, and at the same time, you're looking to get technological innovation that effectively gives you the ability to improve the efficiency of all these systems.
Absolutely. Red tape is killing sustainability. There are so many standards, so many different processes, nobody understands it. And many of them were designed and they were enacted in silos. The regulators, the experts that have been expertising for so long, and we're still stuck. What Panama is doing, we're doing new regulations, but we're doing it with the private sector. We're doing it with the communities. We have conducted the 3 largest public consultations in the history of environmental policy making in Panama, to design our green transition law, to design our adaptation decree so that we can take care of those communities on the front lines, and also to design our commitments that we're submitting to the UN on Thursday. That includes a reduction of at least 11% of our emissions and includes the restoration of 100,000 hectares all over Panama, which will take us to be zero deforestation by 2035. And all of this is an economic development strategy for the rural areas where investments have been so low, and it is time for these communities to not only continue protecting the environment, but to get paid for it. And that's why with this restoration, we're going to be creating thousands of jobs.
Yeah, and Gregorio, I think it's an excellent point that was brought up, that regulation by enforcement is never a successful strategy.
Yeah.
Or for example, by 2030, 2035, everybody in California, as an example, has to have an EV car,
Yeah.
right?
I mean,
The infrastructure is not available,
Yeah.
it's not scalable, it's not affordable, and it goes back to what Juan Carlos was saying, if it doesn't enable the community, it's not going to go anywhere.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, the goals have to be realistic and also have to have the tools to make it happen at their best. I mean, if you see the numbers, I mean, by 2030, Latin America needs to deploy 3.12% of the GDP, in maintenance and expansion of infrastructure. That's 2.2 trillion, and that needs a strategy. That's absolutely correct. And Latin America is a great example. It's a market where Santa Ana operates. It's a perfect example of how, with the right strategy, like a blank canvas, because there are so many things to do over there, in all aspects. Infrastructure is a main issue. With the right strategy, you can make things happen, step by step, but clear goals, clear framework, and not red tape. If not, that's not realistic.
Yeah. I think that's part of what the challenge is too, Stephen. The private sector has the ability to move it forward, but if there isn't a framework or cohesive policy in place, it could almost become a regulation by enforcement issue when, oops, we want to change the way it's being operated.
Yeah, no, and I think if things move too far ahead without basic rules, and I agree with what the other panels are saying, and Juan Carlos, we need rules that make sense for economic growth, for protecting our planet, for protecting our communities. And that's a big message we have to our private sector partners is, don't go it alone. You might look at your government, your local government, your national government, the UN system as way too bureaucratic. But we have kind of a mantra with our partners of educate, engage, activate. We need to educate both sides on how they work. Sometimes it involves translation from public to private.
Yes.
And then we need to engage and let's do some pilot projects. Like let's test things out. And then really we need to activate globally to make sure we're solving the problems that we have.
Yeah, and Dr. Wahba, making sure that we're providing solutions for problems that actually exist.
Correct.
Right, and that's kind of always been the challenge where you're not speaking to the right audience to get the right buy-in. I mean, even think about U.S. infrastructure as an example, which we've discussed. It's also a national security issue as well, and we can't ignore that. And there's, I think, that's something we need to consider as well when we're having this energy conversation and protecting our assets.
Yeah, absolutely. That has been an ongoing discussion within the U.S., which is how can we continue to invest in our infrastructure and in particular support sectors where maybe the private sector is not able to do it on its own, yet there is a massive national security component. And I think in a way this is what this administration has tried to do, which is to identify these areas where private sector is not able to do it on its own. And so government is basically saying, instead of having a major regulation that I'm going to try and put in place, pass it through Congress and take another 10 years for it to happen, I'm going to go in and identify particular areas, particular companies that need the support. That, I think, is the beginning, in my view, of a potentially very fruitful framework that the US can have. That is going to lead, in my view, to the development of things like a sovereign fund that you and I talked about in the past. So where you have the ability to invest in strategic areas and complement what the private sector is doing.
Absolutely, and the conversation about infrastructure is not only about more infrastructure, it's about better infrastructure. Because all the roads or the highways, everything that we built in the past decades, they were done with formulas and equation for materials that won't perform well in the new climate reality era. So with the help of the Inter-American Development Bank, we're upgrading all the formulas and all the material equations for public infrastructure in Panama, so that what we build, we make sure is resilient, can sustain the impacts that are coming our way. We have also designed what we call the Panama risk atlas. So it doesn't matter where you live in Panama, you can go into this map, you can zoom in into your house, and something will pop up and it's going to tell you what are the risks that you're going to be facing in the next 10, 15 years based on the best projections that we have of the climate reality in Panama in the future. So we need to put science at the center of every investment that we do, because the reality is that the climate is changing and it's going to continue changing, and we must make sure that we climate proof everything that we do, and infrastructure is
But that's a very good point, because in the US we haven't continuously updated our equations when it comes to inputs for construction elements. My state of Florida has been doing that in light of hurricanes, in light of some disasters that have happened recently, like the collapse of one of the buildings in Miami, which was a tragedy, in fact, which is the impetus behind my book, as you remember. But that's the kind of thing that you need to be able to do. With it, you want to bring in the technology that can provide the components, but those components need to be at a cost that makes economic sense. Otherwise, no one will want to use it. So there has to be a market that allows people to say, I'm going to buy this concrete because it's cheaper and it's more resilient to climate changes.
I mean, adaptability at the end of the day, it's one thing to build construction, but if it's not adaptable, as we're seeing in the US, I mean, our infrastructure, many of, it's 40 years old, and we haven't.
And you'll pay the cost later.
Yes, of course. I think another, Stephen, another piece of the buy-in as well, when we think about having the skill sets to execute on all of these plans, upskilling, reskilling, these are long-term jobs. They are well-paid salary jobs, and that's part of the circular economy because it goes back into the economy. So the argument as an economic investment into the country or anyone's region of the world.
Yeah, and I think a key part of the innovation that's happening in the developed world, you mentioned the US and infrastructure and all these things, that's amazing. We need to make sure that also gets to the developing world and the countries like small island states that are on the front lines of the climate crisis. So what does that look like? Some of that is technology transfer. We have a program called the SDG Data Alliance in partnership with the UN and a company called Esri, where we are transferring, geospatial information and software to these countries to help them better understand and map their territories and make better decisions. We are building capacity on the ground with governments, with communities. That's one example, but across the line, all these innovations that come out in the developed world, we need to find ways that they make it to Latin America, to island nations, to Africa, et cetera, if we're gonna be successful.
Well, I mean, in many cases, the infrastructure is leapfrogged, what we have here, for that reason, because you don't have the, the drawback of having to integrate legacy infrastructure, technology, physical or otherwise.
Yeah, that's very important because at the end you have to plan with the strategy. In the case of what we're doing in Santa Ana, we just have a great location where we address the impact, not just of the development itself, but also around. And that impact is just on the communities, on the society, on every single thing, because sustainability is not just about environment at the very end. It's people first, always. I mean, and that's have to do with long-term jobs, better skilled jobs, the community taking part of everything that is happening around all these new developments. Later on comes infrastructure, of course, and that infrastructure, as you said, and you said yes, have to have all the transfer of technology that make it resilient and better regarding mobility and utilities as well. Later on we come with the construction, of course, that technology, the transfer of technology also help us to do that construction better. Then later on, the maintenance and waste management, just to make that circular economy, make it happen, but with the people in the middle.
Yeah, I mean, you can't put a price on human capital, that's for sure. 30 seconds, last point.
Capacity building is the most underrated, underfunded component of this entire conversation and is the most needed. For example, we wanted to have a national carbon market, but we had to practice for 4 years because we didn't have the experts to help the companies to measure the carbon footprint and to buy good credits. So capacity building in the private sector, in the government, in civil society. We work with public a lot in these kind of issues. So most underrated and most needed.
All right, appreciate everyone's insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks, and thanks for joining me from MarketSite. I'm Joe Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.